Okay, so in today's class, we are going to look at the theory behind clustering and classification. So a, a key point that machine learning is based on optimization. So machine learning is based on unfortunately, machine learning is based on optimization. This is the first key point. And the idea is what we do is we find a low rank subspace that can represent the data. And to find this low rank subspace, we have looked at SVD, we looked at PCA, and we looked at wavelets. And then we use some type of regression methods to find out the cluster and to classify the data. So all this is part of data science. And essentially, they also call this as predictive analysis. So it's part of the data science and predictive analysis. Now, in last class, I briefly talked about what are the different types of machine learning techniques. So there is something called as, and we talked about something called as supervised learning. And you have something called as unsupervised learning. In supervised learning, the data is labeled. So data is labeled. And the sort of the input and the output is explicitly known. Now, there are actually sometimes you can do this interactively. Sometimes what you do is not the entire data set is labeled, the partial data set is labeled. So there are, depending upon what type of labeling is done, what type of data set that is available, you can have a complete supervised learning, or you could have a semi-supervised learning. Now, in addition to that, you can actually have something called as the reinforcement learning, reinforcement learning. So the idea is you have some rewards, you have some punishments, and that are the training labels that shape the regression technique. Now, again, in today's lesson, we are going to look at some theory part, but here is the key objective. So we want to use statistical techniques to come up with a regression model to construct and sort of exploit the feature space, which is supposed to be the low rank feature space of the given data set. And let me give you an example. Say, for an example, if you have a person and if you take a picture of a person, and then what you want to do is you want to look at the key features or key attributes that define that person. So clearly that person could be like certain height, certain weight, certain gender, certain education. So these sort of are the features, or in other words, the low dimensional subspace that we really want to use for classification and maybe training. So the first example that we talked about in last class is something called as the irises data. So iris is a flower. So basically it's a beautiful flower, and you are welcome to just Google iris, IRIS, and then it will show you a very nice, beautiful flower. And there are different types. Actually, as a matter of fact, there are, if I'm not mistaken, there are about 150 types of those flowers. So, but in the first data set, we are going to look at 3 interesting varieties. So we looked at setosa, versicolor, and virginica. So these are the types of flower inside that iris data set. And if you recollect, and I'm gonna just type the code in the chat window. So in case you don't have access, just use this code. So this is the code that we used. I want you to run this code. And once you run this code, you are gonna get a nice plot. And that plot is indicative of different varieties of irises. Now, what do you have on x-axis, what do you have on y-axis, and what do you have on z-axis? So on x-axis, could you tell us the line number? So yeah, so the first section from line number 2 to line number 13. So first section of the code. Okay, so on x-axis, you have something called as the sepal length, which is the length. On the z-axis, depending upon how you look at it, you have sepal width, and then you have the petal length. So basically, from this data set, there are lots of features that are in that data set, but basically 3 subcomponents or sub-features like height, weight, and gender. You have sepal length, sepal width, and petal length that allows us to plot this data set. Now, one thing I want to tell you is setosa is sort of the distinct. Green is setosa. So setosa is most distinct. But versicolor and virginica, they have some overlap. So you are welcome to rotate the data, and you will notice setosa is sort of on one side, but versicolor and virginica, they are combined together. So from just looking at it, maybe you may be able to distinguish between the setosa and other 2 varieties, but you may not be able to distinguish or differentiate between versicolor and virginica. So here is the classic problem. How do we, even though we know what those varieties are, all of a sudden, if a new data set comes in the picture. So if I give you certain length, a certain sepal length, certain sepal width, and certain petal length, then whether it is setosa, versicolor, or virginica. So that is something that we want to decide. And the idea is, yes, so this can be, so right now what we can do is we can come up with some sort of interesting algorithm. Say I'm going to multiply the sepal length multiplied by sepal width multiplied by square of petal length and see if I can get a better classification. That is the key result of SVM. So you are trying to find out a hyperplane or some sort of differentiation between the features. The features could be the derived features or they could be the inherent features. Now the next example which I want to talk about, and even though we ran through the code, I want to look at the dog data and cat data. So what I want to do is I want you to look at the as a second example, this dog data and cat data. So what is this dog data and cat data? So this is an image database. So there are 80 dogs and 80 cats. And what is our objective? Our objective is somehow come up with a smart algorithm so that as soon as I feed the new image, then the algorithm can automatically classify whether that image belongs to a dog or whether that image belongs to a cat. And what I want to do is, at this point, just first run the data set. In other words, I'm gonna give you the first, I will type the code in the chat window. You are welcome to use the code and run it, or you can run the line 15 to 27. So once you run the line from 15 to 27, you are gonna see an image. So you will see this image, and this is the image that is showing you maybe some predominant features of cats and dogs. And at this point, I just want to tell you what is happening mathematically in this figure. Mathematically, what's happening is you have the dog images and you have cat images. And what we do is we are creating a matrix where all the dog images and all the cat images are positioned next to each other. So if you look at the line, which is line number 17, you have a cat and dog image that is expressed as a big matrix. So line number 17 from the code. And this is the whole data set. And what we are doing is we are running SVD, U, S, and V on this dog and cat data set. So this is being run on dog and cat data set. Now what does SVD do? SVD finds out something called as the eigenfaces and then singular values and then basically the weight vector. So in the figure 3, what you have in the figure 3, it's showing you the first 4 columns of U matrix. Everyone understood this? In figure 3, it is showing you the first 4 columns. And those are the most important eigenfaces from this image data set. And as you can see that this image data set has some cats, some dogs. So if the question is, what are the most important features of cats and what are the most important features of dogs? The top row kind of tells you the first two important features of the cat, and the bottom two show you the most important features of dog. And then the idea is, please note, initial data set is something called as the image space or the pixel space. Now here, the representation is okay, but the representation is not crisp. What do I mean by saying crisp? Is the edges. If you look at the edges are not sharp. So we have some features, but those features are not sharp. So what do we do to basically get those sharp features? So to get those features or to make those features sharp, what we do is we use the wavelet analysis. So what I want you to do is I want you to run the code from line 62 to line 76. I want you to run the code from line 62 to line 76. So I'm gonna copy this. So here, so what has happened is you are dealing with the same data set and you did the exact same thing. You did the SVD, but now the data that you fed to SVD was decomposed in wavelet. So you used the wavelet decomposition. And what was the advantage of the wavelet decomposition? I want you to take a moment to compare the previous figure with the next figure. You will notice that the shapes are much more defined. So in other words, the wavelet representation is helping to emphasize key features such as eyes, nose, and ears. And I'm gonna give you an example here. Is look at the first row, first column, second row, second column. You would notice that the features are more predominant. The edges are more predominant. And that is what the wavelet decomposition did for us. So basically, when you ran that, you will notice that the wavelet decomposition gave us a better representation. And if you want to plot the wavelet decomposition, I would encourage you to run from line 79 to line 84. And please note figure 7 that's going to appear. Everyone got figure 7? So question, everyone got figure 7? So can you notice in figure number 7, and I want you to compare that with the first figure that we generated. Can you notice the eyes of the cat or the nose or other features? They are sharp. And what do I mean by sharp? Are we analyzing some different data set? No, we are analyzing the exact same data set, but rather than running the SVD on the base data set, what we did, we actually used the projection of that base data set onto a wavelet basis and then obtained a sharper image or sharper mode. Everyone understood this? Now, I would emphasize this once again. So what these are nothing but eigenfaces. Remember the eigenfaces example that we studied some time ago, wherein we looked at the images and then we did the SVD on the images and plotted the eigenfaces or the sub-components, significant principal components. The same thing is happening here. when you have in SVD, the U matrix is nothing but the eigenfaces, and then S is the singular value, and then the V matrix is going to give you the weight matrix, which is called as the loading, or so how important is each feature in that SVD decomposition. So V matrix is also called as the loading matrix or the weighting, so weight matrix. Now, I did not emphasize this in the last class, but I want you to understand that you can plot the histograms and then see the loading distribution on each. So what do I mean by the histogram? So if you want to visualize the weighting of each component, then you can plot the histogram. You can find out the probability density function, and that will tell you that how important is each mode for in the data set. So everyone understood? Any question? And again, we are not going to do anything with this yet. Let me discuss some more theory, and then we will look at the actual application of this. Okay, now what we want to do is, I want to actually talk about the differences between the supervised and unsupervised learning. Now, as I said, in supervised learning, you have the labels. In unsupervised learning, you do not have labels. But supervised learning nowadays has a lot of innovation going on. So there is something called as the semi-supervised learning. There is something called as the active learning, and there is something called as the reinforcement learning. So there is reinforcement learning, there is semi-supervised learning, there is active learning, there is transfer learning. So there are lots and lots of innovations and research in this area. Now, so just to show you the differences, I want to give you a very simple example. So to give you to sort of give you an example, so what we are going to do is, if you look at the unsupervised learning, it's like you have clusters and you want to separate out those clusters. And if you want to do the supervised learning, then even though you have clusters, those clusters are already named. So basically you can actually name those clusters. So let's look at, and I ran that code in last class, but let's look at the first technique in unsupervised learning and the theory behind K-means clustering. So what we want to do is we want to see how this K-mean clustering works. So imagine, say you have a data set, and in this data set, this is the data. And then you have another data which is over here. Now in K-means, what's going to happen is you are going to start with the first iteration. And in first iteration, you are going to start with a pair of data. So if you want to use K2 mean, so basically what you will do is you are going to take a look at this point and this point. And you are going to start with an assumed mean. So you will say that this is the mean of the black data. But then once you calculate the mean, you would observe that this mean actually shifts over here. So initial assumption is no longer correct, and you got your mean shifted over here. So now what you're going to do is you are going to move on to the next data set, and you are going to find out the mean between these two. So you clearly observe that once I find the mean, your new mean is going to be somewhere over here. So the old mean goes away. So now what has happened, that when you consider effectively data point 1, data point 2, and data point 3, we observe that their mean is located over here. And assuming this process is repeated for the entire data set, if this process is repeated for the entire data set, what's going to happen is the final mean, so this is your final mean, will be somewhere close to first data set, second data set, and third data set. And that mean is not going to vary a lot. That mean will stay where it is. Same process is going to go over here. So first I'm going to take these two, find the mean. Then I'm going to take these two, find the mean, and neglect the original mean. So, and that convergence would give me two cluster differences. So what I want to do is, but then how do we check if our classification is correct or incorrect? So what for that, we can actually run the basic algorithm that was proposed by Lloyd. So this Stuart Lloyd initially proposed this algorithm in 1960s. So the next line, the line of code, is actually plotting the entire Stuart's algorithm. So this is basically the implementation of Stuart's algorithm. So let's start step by step. So what I want you to do is, I want you to run line 150 to line 160. So I want you to run line 150 to line 160. So first run this, highlight this line, run this line. Then I want you to run line from 163. I want you to run line 163 to line 163, just a second, 163 to line 220. So I want you to run line 163 from line 220. So everyone should get figure 1. Did you get this figure 1? So basically in figure 1, we are going to have a plot, the 4 images. The image on the left is only black and white. Image on the right will have again the same black and white image, but on top of it you will have the green and magenta dots. Everyone got this figure? So this, in this figure, this shows you the difference between the supervised and unsupervised learning. So the black image, okay, black image is nothing but a data set which shows the supervised unsupervised learning that is trying to find out clusters. So for an example, if I want to separate out these two clusters, I want to look at the image, first row, first column image. You will see a cluster on the left and a cluster on the right. So this boundary is clear. On the other hand, if you look at the image on the right, you have green labels and magenta labels. So green labels indicate one data set, magenta label indicates the other data set. Now, what we are doing is, if you proceed to the overlapping data, the overlapping data is the second row, first column figure. Second row, first column figure shows you overlapping data. When you have overlapping data, then it becomes super duper complex. We are not able to separate out. But still there, if you were to superimpose that with the supervised learning, if you know the labels, then there is some amount of classification that is available. So the key point here is, when the data is clearly separated, then unsupervised learning would work for classification. But if the data is entangled, then classification is difficult even with supervised learning. Even though you have data labels, it's going to be difficult. Before I proceed further, any questions on the figure? Okay. Then what we are going to do is, we are going to move forward, and then we are going to look at the next part of the code. In the next part of the code, what we are going to do is, from line 222, Kmean. Yeah, I haven't not discussed Kmean yet. So just hold on a second. So I will discuss Kmean in just a second. So I just wanted to go and explain, give you some background. The next part, so Kmeans would come from line 254. We are not there yet. So line 222, I want you to look at line 222 and go all the way to line 253. Line 222 and go to line 253. And I would like to take a moment to explain this figure, which I tried to explain in class, but I think I didn't do a good job. So let me again just tell you what that is. So basically, you should see two panels, one panel on the left and one panel on the right. Now, panel on the left, what you have is, separation boundary is difficult because this sort of shows a nonlinear separation. Same thing happens with the panel on the right. The data shows separation, some type of separation, but clearly you can't draw a straight line that would actually separate out the magenta data versus the green data. So please understand that the data set on the left, the figure on the left and the figure on the right again shows you that the simple linear regression or linear separation is not possible. So now let's talk about the K-means clustering. Everyone with me for K-means clustering? Okay, for K-means clustering, I want you to look at the code from line number 254. Okay, I want you to look at the line number 254 all the way to line number 281. So please highlight line 254 to line number 281 and please run it. So what's going to happen is, you are going to see the same type of data set, but in that data set, you have some red dots and you have some blue dots. Now, what I want to do is, I want to run the K-means clustering. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to do the K-means clustering. So let's go to line number 283. Line number 283. and I want you to select all the way up to line number 313, all the way to line 313 and evaluate. And let me explain what is happening with this data. So this is where we see the K-mean clustering algorithm working. Everyone with me? Everyone got figure number 2? In figure number 2, you should see 4 panels. So in each panel, you are going to have some red and some blue dots. And then you are going to have some black dots or black circles. Do you agree with me? Everyone got that figure number 2? Okay. Now let me explain K-means clustering based on the Lloyd's algorithm. So first and foremost, heuristically, we are saying that there will be 2 clusters. And what I want to say is I want to separate out these 2 clusters. So how do I separate out these 2 clusters? I start with the initial guess for the means. The initial guess for the means is shown in the first panel, which is the very first panel, top leftmost panel. First row, first column, the panel, that is where what we are starting with. Since we have 2 clusters, we are starting initially with a mean, 2 means that we assume. And then what we do is we are actually going through the data set, and then we are iterating. We are going through the data set and we are iterating and trying to update those means. So what I want you to do is I want you to look at the first row, second column. So the panel on the right, topmost right panel. Can you see that the means have gone apart? The black dots, initially the black dots were not centered at those clusters. But on the right hand side, can you see that these 2 black dots have separated a little bit? Now we are going through one more iteration, and you would notice that these 2 black dots have separated even further out, even though the data set is the same. As we start including more and more data points, these black dots, they go away from each other. Do you agree with me? That is what is saying that the means are getting updated. So initial means are plotted in black dots in the very first panel. The updated means are plotted in the second panel. One more iteration, updated means are plotted on the second row, first column. And the final, after the 4th iteration, can you see that those black dots sort of lie at the center of those clusters? Are you with me so far? So this is the K-means algorithm in action. So Saranch, did I answer your question? K-means algorithm in action. So in the first iteration, K-means were apart. Second iteration, K-means were close. The means were close. In the second iteration, they went a little bit out. Third iteration, they went farther out. And the 4th iteration, as you can see, the 2 clusters. Yes, that is correct. So if some data is extremely big, the means may pull out. And in that case, there are additional techniques that you wanna wait. Or what you wanna do is you want to use some sort of smart sampling technique. So rather than running the clustering on the complete data set, you will have a sample data set where you will be running the clustering. Does that answer your question, Chia? Okay. Now, what I want to do is, I want to go a step further, and then I want you to look at line number 316 to line number 333. So the first code is the basic Lloyd's algorithm, Stuart Lloyd's algorithm, the way he explained in that paper, implemented in MATLAB. That is not the smartest way of handling large data set. So MATLAB has a built-in function for Kmeans that is shown on line number 317, that is designed to take or to handle large data sets. So at this point, I would just recommend that close the figures, close all the figures, and then basically try to run the entire code. Try to run the entire code. And you will notice that you will get a classification using MATLAB, and it will actually plot a classifier line. So classification line can also be used. But next point which I want to talk about, and there was a question about this, is dendrograms. So dendrograms, what is this dendrogram? Dendrogram is unsupervised hierarchical clustering. So dendrograms is hierarchical clustering. There are two ways. There is something called as dendrograms that is generated using the agglomerative techniques. And there is a dendrogram that is generated using divisive techniques. So in the agglomerative dendrograms, you merge the data in pairs and create a hierarchy of structures. And in divisive dendrograms, you actually construct a single cluster and then start splitting it up. So again, so there are different ways of generating dendrograms. So dendrograms usually can be run in following sequence. So let me show you how this dendrogram technique works. So again, we have this data set. So we have one data, we have this data, we have this data, and we have this data. So what I'm going to do is, in the first iteration, I'm going to find out the two data sets that are the closest to each other. So let me see, this is my first data point, second data point, third data point, and fourth data point. Clearly, second data point and third data point, they are very close to each other. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to combine them together. And then what I would do is, at the center of the distance, so you have certain distance between these two. So this is the distance. And at the center, I will add a virtual data set. So this is the virtual data set that is at the center. And then I'm going to find out the distances, say D1, and I'm going to find D2. And I will see whether D1 is closed or D2 is closed. Clearly, assuming D1 is closed, then I would ignore this, and then I would actually treat this as part of the cluster, and then I would place the mean over here. So in a sense, it looks like the K-mean clustering, but here is a difference. So I have this data set. So first 2 and 3, they are close to each other. So I know that 2 and 3 are close to each other. Then please note this dendrogram, this indicates the distance between these two clusters. So this is, so I'm going to call this D bar. This is the distance between these two clusters. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to repeat the process, and I'm going to try to find the distance between 1 and 4. And now we noticed that 1 is closer. So this distance is nothing but D1. So this is D1. Now, then I will form the last cluster, which is over here. So this hierarchical structure is nothing but the dendrogram. And these distances are nothing but the distances between the data clusters. So you actually find out the distances or between the data points. And now you can define the distance in terms of multiple ways. You can find out the Euclidean distance, which is like maybe x square plus y square, or you can find out some weighted distance, which is a square Euclidean distance, or you can find out just a Manhattan distance, or you can find out the maximum distance, or you can find out the Mahalanobis distance. So there are different types of distances criterion that you can use. But that is what the dendrogram is all about. Now what I want to do is, at this point, I want you to highlight the dendrogram code, which is line number 337 to line number 348, and then run this code. So line number 337 to line number 348. And now, can you see that this dendrogram is constructed? Are you with me so far? Now, what does this tell me? It tells me that if I were to cluster this data, there are two important clusters. There is a red cluster and there is sort of a sky blue cluster. There is a red cluster and there is a sky blue cluster. Code seems to have some errors. Okay, I will go ahead and put that in the chat window. I'll just put the code in the chat window. Just copy this code and please run this code. And I did not do this yesterday, but I want you, this is very important. You should get the dendrogram figure. Did everyone get the dendrogram figure? Okay, now I want you to stretch that dendrogram figure, please. Everyone, please stretch that dendrogram figure. Can you see that on the x-axis, there are numbers? For example, my x-axis, the very first number is 2835. Then I have 28, 35, 30, 14, 43, 23, 26, 36, 31. Can you see those numbers? Stretch that figure so that the x-axis is visible. And can you see those numbers? Everyone, can you see those numbers? So the first number is 28 on x-axis. The first number is 28. The second number is 35. Can you see that the dendrogram, you can't? I can share my screen. Okay, does everyone see my dendrogram? Okay, this is the figure that you should get. So now I want you to notice that the first number on the x-axis is 28. The second number on the x-axis is 35. Can you see that these two numbers have one horizontal line between them? That horizontal line indicates the actual distance between these two data points. And that indication is that these two data points are very close to each other. And if you were to look at same thing, 2 and 46, they are close to each other. Then 11 and 34, they are close to each other. So basically first rung of that dendrogram shows you out of this big data set, which is the closest. Everyone understood this? Then next iteration. So look at 28, 35, and 30. Can you see that it's the second rung is from the midpoint of 28, 35 to 30. Now that is the indication that 28, 35, and 30 are very close to each other. And now it's a computer algorithm. It will repeat this process, and this dendrogram gets plotted. Now I want you to start from the top. Okay, at this point, I want you to start from the top. Can you see as you go from the top, that dendrogram is split into two branches? You have a branch on the left and you have a branch on the right. Do you agree with me? You have a branch on the left and you have branch on the right. So what this tells me that if I want to classify this entire data in two clusters, then there is a red cluster on the left and there is the sky blue cluster on the right. Everyone understood this? If I want to go a further, in that red cluster, you would see that there is a separation. So there are some data sets on the left, some data sets on the right. So depending upon the granularity that you want, you can actually perform the classification. Everyone understood this? I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So sharing the screen. So that is how any question from Aryan? Okay. Okay. All right. So the next part which I want to talk about is this data set is all great. This classification is all great. But then what happens if the individual data point or this cluster has some noise, which means the points are not sharp. They have certain variance and they have certain mean. So in that case, what you do is you go to something called as the mixture models. And what is the advantage of mixture models? The basic advantage of mixture model is it can compensate or it can account for the mean and the variance of the data. So that is the best part. And so for mixture models, here is the idea. In mixture models, it derives its roots from statistical analysis. So in the statistical analysis, there is a famous technique which is called as expectation maximization algorithm. Expectation maximization algorithm, also known as EM algorithm. This EM algorithm if you think about the basic part of it, it proceeds like K-means clustering algorithm. The only thing here is there are two things. It is going to assume the mean and it is going to assume the variance. So in K-means, what we are doing is we just looked at the mean. In expectation minimization algorithm, you have mean and you have variance. And then what we do is this expectation maximization algorithm iteratively goes through the data set, and starting with initial guess for the mean and variance, it updates the means and variance. And again, the statistically, there is a lot of math that goes on. So there is something called as you have to find the probability density functions, then you have to find out the distribution, and so on and so forth. But the idea, the basic fundamental idea is something, it is similar to K-means, but rather than just updating the mean, it is updating the mean and variance. Everyone understood this? That is the crux of Gaussian mixture model. And the relationship between the mean and the variance is given in terms of the classic Gaussian distribution. So basically you have something called as the mean, and then you have first sigma variation, second sigma variation, and 3 sigma variation. So that is what is driving this GMM algorithm. So GMM is again used for unsupervised learning. And what I want you to do is you can actually run the second part of the code. So I want you to run the code from line 352 to line 386. So evaluate. And I'm going to copy this in the chat window. So now you would see figure number 1. Everyone got figure number 1? Okay. What are we seeing in figure number 1? In figure number 1, you see the same data set that we dealt earlier. And this same data set is belonging to dog and cat. So what we are trying to see here is you have the circles, and those circles basically have some concentric circles. And now I want you to visualize this. Imagine you actually look at the smallest or the innermost circle and pull that circle up. I want you to look at the innermost circle and pull that circle up. And what you get is you get a wrinkle in the fabric. And that wrinkle in the fabric is shown on the right-hand side. Everyone understood this? So I want you to imagine that you have X and Y, and you have this fabric. And imagine the innermost circle, you pinch and you pull that fabric up. Then what you get is you get how that fabric is folded. That is nothing but the distribution of the data. So if you look at the figure on the right-hand side, it has X, Y, and Z axis. The exact same figure, which is on the left-hand side, is now projected in X, Y, and Z axis, except the Z axis of that figure is indicative of the distribution of the data. So you can see clearly that in that fabric, there are two peaks. One peak that shows the distribution of cat features, which is on the right-hand side, and another thing shows the distribution of dog features. And what is that? That is nothing but the probability density function, which is, so on Z-axis, you have PDF of the Gaussian model, and basically that shows you the probability distribution of the data set. Everyone understood this? Any questions here? Okay. All right. So next part, what I want to talk about, so in PCA we find vectors. So to clarify, Chiao, that vector in PCA what you find is not the variance. The vectors that you find, those are, oh, actually you mean the, yeah. So you mean the sigmas you find to PCA. Let me backtrack. For PCA, what you do is you actually subtract the mean. So mean is gone, and what you get is the variance, but it's a zero mean process. So basically what you have is the variance. It's for the zero mean process because the means are subtracted. Okay, does that answer your question, Chia? Okay. Now, next thing what I want to talk about is the concept of supervised learning. In supervised learning, the very old technique which was invented in 1930s is called the linear discriminant analysis, also called as LDA. LDA is solving an optimization problem to find a subspace where the data shows separation. And if you look at the mathematics of LDA is purely based on the variance and mean. Again, if you look at the mathematics of LDA, it's completely based on variance and mean. So what I want to do is, I want to quickly walk you through the code, which is line number 407. And then I want you to go to line 425, 407 to 425. And when you go to 407 and 425, I want you to look at the plot that has been generated. So unfortunately, that figure is not plotted correctly, my fault, but I want you to stretch the figure, and then you will notice that that is the data set that we want to classify. So as you can see, that data set is again the same data set, cats and dogs. So the data set that we are playing with is the same data set, cats and dogs, but now I want to use the LDA to separate out cats from dogs. So you have this same data set. Now what you do is add the next part to it, and you'll see that cat data set, and I want to use some sort of linear discriminant analysis to separate out the cat and dog data set. So what I want you to do now is I want you to basically just give me a second here. I will update, I'll show you which code to use. So let me quickly give you the code. Unfortunately, that code is on line 474. Okay, that line 474 and you go down to 518. So 474 to 518. And I'm going to paste it. 474 to 578. Okay. Are you with me? We again are dealing with the same data set, cats and dogs. We are dealing with the same data set, cats and dogs. Now, I want to separate these two out. On the left-hand side, I have used the linear discriminant, which is an inclined line. And on the right-hand side, I have used a quadratic discriminant, which is the curve. But that is the basic idea. So everyone understood? Everyone got the linear discriminant left, right? And the linear discriminant on the left and the quadratic discriminant on the right. Okay, awesome. And the idea is again using the means and variance to run through the analysis. And the last part, which I kind of rushed, is support vector machines. And the idea of support vector machines to come up with a derived feature that would allow us to create a hyperplane. So now to explain the support vector machine, what you want to do is, again, you can use a linear SVM, linear support vector machine, or you can use a nonlinear support vector machine. And in linear support vector machine, you want to find out the line that is discriminating data. And in the nonlinear support vector machine, you want to find out a curve. And why is this called a hyperplane? It's called hyperplane because it essentially, it could be a plane in 3, 4, 5, 6 dimensions. So it's not just a plane. Plane is usually in 3 dimensions, but support vector machine can construct a plane that is in 4, 5, 6 dimensions. That's why it's called as a hyperplane. So what I want to do is, I want you quickly to highlight or run code. And let me tell you the lines. It's a big code. So line 574, highlight 574 to 651. And I'm going to paste that code here. And this is again, same data set that we earlier looked at, wherein you had 2 clusters. One cluster was inside the outside cluster. So you had a magenta cluster and you had a green cluster. Now, what we want to do is we want to find out the separation boundaries. The separation boundary is a circle, but where to draw the circle? So what we are going to do is we are going to find out the radius. And that radius is found out by this derived feature. And that derived feature is nothing but a product of those 2 features. So those 2 initial features are multiplied together in some nonlinear fashion. And then we are finding out the distances. So if you look at line 597 and 598, that is where Z1 is found from X1, Y1, Z2 is found from X2, Y2. And then, as you can see, if I plot X1, Y1, Z1 and X2, Y2, Z2, I can clearly see that the magenta cluster stays at the bottom and the green data set, the green cluster, rises on top. So I can create a threshold based on the Z value. I can create a threshold based on the Z value, and then I can actually classify those 2 clusters. So that is the crux of the support vector machine. And the next thing is you can run the support vector machine on dogs and cats. And then you can run the support vector machine on iris data. The only problem with support vector machine is computation of the vectors is prohibitively expensive. So for that, what we do is we use something called as the kernel trick. And kernel trick is basically decomposition of that vector so that the problem can be solved in real time. So that is what is the basis of support vector machine. But I want to tell you that with advancement in deep learning architectures and algorithms, you can actually replace the support vector machine and decision trees with deep learning neural networks. And that is what we will discuss from step by step by next class onwards. So I'm going to stop here and I would be happy to